We know the protest actually increased the spread of the virus. You've said that.
I said crowds. I didn't say specifically. I didn't say protests do anything.
So the protests don't increase the spread of the virus?
I didn't say that. You're putting words in my mouth.
Well, that was Dr. Anthony Fauci in yet another heated exchange with a Republican lawmaker. For those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's the face of the American government's fight against the coronavirus. And he may be an 80-year-old scientist, but he gives as good as he gets. A veteran public health expert, he served 7 US presidents and knows how to survive the slings and arrows of Washington. His supporters believe he's done a great job in difficult circumstances, especially under President Trump. But his detractors think he's made a mess of the coronavirus response, and some believe he's not just incompetent, but corrupt. More recently, his enemies claim the release of thousands of his emails bear out their worst fears. But do they?
All of the things that I have spoken about consistently from the very beginning have been fundamentally based on science. Sometimes those things were inconvenient truths. People want to fire me or put me in jail for what I've done, namely follow the science.
A lot of people were not familiar with Dr. Fauci before this pandemic, but he is definitely not new on the scene.
He's been the director of the Allergy and Infectious Disease branch of the NIH since 1984, and he has served 7 presidents.
Bottom line, it's going to get worse.
The virus death toll climbing above 200,000 Americans.
500,000.
600,000.
We've been an abject failure, Tony.
Yeah.
He is affiliated with no party. He's worked for Democratic and Republican presidents, but now he's become a Republican boogeyman.
Grouchy Fauci, Dr. Doom and Gloom, Dr. Flip-Flop Fauci.
An activist scientist, an arm of the China's propaganda machine.
Right now, Dr. Fauci is facing an extraordinary backlash after the public disclosure of thousands of Dr. Fauci's emails.
With the most contentious emails relating to the origins of the COVID pandemic.
Republicans say they found their smoking gun, that he misled the public and downplayed theories that COVID spread from a leak in a Wuhan lab.
The emails show the founder of an institute, EcoHealth Alliance, with ties to the lab, thanking Fauci for supporting the theory that COVID naturally developed.
The mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
Now, there are some of your critics who say this shows you have too cozy of a relationship with the people behind the Wuhan lab research. What do you say to that?
Oh, that's nonsense. I don't even see how they get that from that email.
He's been wrong on almost every issue, and he was wrong on Wuhan and the lab also, very wrong.
A lot of what you're seeing as attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. And we have up top left there, Natalie Bettendorf, a journalist for BuzzFeed, which obtained Dr. Fauci's emails through a Freedom of Information request. Then we have Dr. William Schaffner, an infectious disease expert and a former advisor to the CDC. Dr. Rich McCormick is an ER doctor and former Republican congressional candidate. And finally, Tim Trevan is a biological safety consultant and has consulted in China on biological risk management and elsewhere. Welcome, all of you, to the program. Natalie, I'd like to start with you. Why did you make BuzzFeed make this Freedom of Information request for Dr. Fauci's emails in the first place?
Well, I think it's something that BuzzFeed News has done for a while. We do FOIA requests because we want to get documents from government agencies. And something that we do at BuzzFeed is we make sure to, after reading through them, writing our story, we publish them so it's available to the public. So we obtained 3,200 plus pages of Dr. Fauci's emails from the beginning of 2020 in the first 6 months, and really saw and got to read in real time what was happening with this pandemic.
Rather strangely, this Freedom of Information request has yielded many, many emails that have been so heavily redacted, you don't know what's going on in them.
It's really interesting because when you receive documents from a government agency, there are actually quite a few exemptions. So that means everything that we published was stuff that we couldn't read as well. So that black box that you see in front of those documents is something that probably has to do with national security or privacy or other health reasons, or something that could be related to someone's health history. And so that's the reasons that we can't see certain information in these emails.
And I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, that most of these thousands of emails were very sort of benign and very uninteresting, but the media has picked up on two I'd like to discuss with you. One of them says, it's from the head of the NIH, Francis Collins. I guess that's Fauci's boss, essentially. And it's straight to Fauci saying, the subject heading, conspiracy gains momentum, and a link to a Fox News article is included, which talks about the Wuhan lab leak theory. As we can see, the rest of it is redacted. Rich, if I may ask you, what is the big deal about this particular email?
Well, as you know, America was founded on a mistrust of government to begin with. And when we have things like this, it just solidifies our mistrust of the government. This is the problem. We've made this a very political situation rather than something about medicine. This should have been about businesses taking risks based on what the people who come to their businesses are willing to take, what doctors are willing to tell their patients, and how we deal with the disease. It shouldn't be about politics, and that's the problem.
Francis Collins then calls it a conspiracy. So he's saying it's a conspiracy theory, essentially. Why is that contentious? Do you think back in April 2020 that was the wrong approach, that was a wrong assessment of it?
I think in some ways there was a conspiracy. First of all, where the disease came from is a big deal. We played politics with that too, with the World Health Organization, with China, with the way that we kowtowed to different political organizations and countries. We didn't always get out the truth because we were worried about how it would affect our political relationships. We haven't been honest with the people about the science behind this disease and how we deal with it. It's created a lot of mistrust and misinformation out there amongst the public around the world.
Yeah. Dr. Schaffner, just to be clear for our viewers, then that particular email was related to a Fox News article talking about the Wuhan lab leak theory, and in putting in the subject heading, conspiracy gains momentum, it seems that Francis Collins and presumably Fauci were writing it off as a conspiracy theory right from the beginning, and people like Fox News find that rather upsetting because they should have been taking it seriously. What do you think?
Well, I think you've represented the circumstances pretty correctly. At that time, and actually still today, most of us in infectious diseases and public health think that this was a natural event. After all, there were two other coronaviruses that had jumped species from the animal kingdom to humans, SARS and MERS. We thought that this was likely to be the case with COVID too. And beyond that, there are many, many other viruses that originated in the animal kingdom and come to us as humans and cause a variety of illnesses. HIV, for example, influenza regularly, West Nile virus, Ebola, Zika, chikungunya, the list goes on and on. So I think at that time, certainly they thought that this was a natural event. Is it reasonable to consider that this might have been a laboratory accident? Sure, that's a reasonable consideration. Is it the more likely? No.
Okay. Let's take a closer look at the other contentious email, which was sent to Dr. Fauci by Dr. Peter Daszak, an executive at EcoHealth Alliance, which gave the Wuhan Institute of Virology US government funds. Now it reads, I just wanted to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators for publicly standing up and stating the scientific evidence supports a natural origin for COVID-19 from a bat to human spillover and not a lab release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Tim, what is contentious in the minds of Fox News and others on the right then about this email?
I think one of the problems with that email from Peter Daszak is that he's conflating two things. He's conflating the natural origins of the virus with it not possibly being a lab leak. Now, it is possible, I'm not saying it's likely or the most likely scenario, but it is possible that a naturally evolved virus could have leaked from the lab. One of the things Peter was doing with his work was collecting coronaviruses by the tens of thousands for analysis in the lab. It's quite possible, again, I'm not saying it's likely or the most likely scenario, but it is quite plausible that something that was collected in the wild might have leaked from the lab before it was properly characterized and properly stored as a human virus rather than as an animal virus.
Well, let's look at the motivation, if I may, about why he might conflate that. I mean, he's not unfamiliar with it, so it possibly was deliberate. Rich McCormick, can you just explain Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance? Why would they be so appreciative of Dr. Fauci's position on this?
Well, once again, it gets back to politics. This is what worries me a little bit, is you have Wuhan, where we have obviously a biological storage place in a country that's obviously not friendly to a lot of people around the world, who's struggling financially, who all of a sudden they have this very rare morphology. And I know that our infectious disease brethren say that we've had other species of viruses that have jumped species, but the problem is this has been a uniquely effective disease process that came from a place of an unfriendly country in a laboratory area and a person who was working in a laboratory. Think about all the consequences that have come from this disease and the world impact it's had and where it came from, when it came from, and the timing of this. It really starts to beat the odds as far as mathematical possibilities of whether it was produced, whether it occurred naturally. Just the timing and the placement of where this disease came from make it very, very suspicious. At least something we should consider as something that can happen again and again if we're not careful.
Yeah, Dr. Schaffner, I mean, isn't it the case that EcoHealth Alliance, if they're responsible for giving out US funds, they are going to be looking for that backup, that relief from Dr. Fauci, that they've given it to the right people and that it's been used in the right way, and that the laboratory, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has been responsible and honest about their work?
Well, I think that that's pretty straightforward, and I think that Dr. Fauci and others at the NIH have been colleagues and collaborators and supporters of their colleagues in the Wuhan laboratory. There isn't any doubt that a possible laboratory accident could have been the source of this virus. Another reason I think it's quite unlikely is that we have similar laboratories all around the world, and indeed, laboratory accidents sometimes do occur. They've happened at the CDC, they've happened at the NIH, but to date, we've never had one that has produced an agent that has gone around the world, whereas it happens frequently in the natural world. Viruses jump from animals to humans and then spread globally.
Natalie, before we get focused in on laboratory safety, let me ask you about Fauci as a medical and political figure for our international viewers, just sort of getting to grips with who he is.
You're making this a personal thing, and it isn't.
It's not a personal thing.
No, you are. That is exactly what you're doing.
No, your recommendations carry a lot of weight, Dr. Fauci.
My recommendations are not a personal recommendation. It's based on the CDC guidance.
How has he become so divisive? Perhaps it's not his fault, but in any case, it's happened. You have people who think he's fantastic, and you think that there are people who think that he should be locked up or fired at the very least.
Yeah, I think that's something that Jason, my co-reporter, and I really analyzed in these emails, was looking at, how the American, everything that is associated with American health is politicized, and the state of our country. I think what these emails say a lot about in how they're received by different political factions of our country, and everyone who's reading them is what they're taking away is what is being politicized. And something that I do as a journalist, while reading these emails, is trying to take that aspect away and read these emails for what they are, while also understanding the political relationships that infiltrate these emails and correspondence between Fauci and other health officials, as well as regular citizens who are just concerned about the virus. So I really think it was a testament to the state of our country, at least between the period that we were reading them, which was January to June of 2020.
Tim Trevant, you're living in the United States. It's easy to criticize people in hindsight, so let's try to avoid doing that. But let's look at his performance, Fauci's performance in leading the America's coronavirus response. Were there times where he got it wrong, or is it just that he followed the science, as he always likes to say, and changed his mind as and when it became apparent that it needed to be changed?
Well, let's not forget that this is called coronavirus because it's a novel coronavirus. It's new. We didn't really, although we have some knowledge about human coronaviruses, this was completely new to us. So that's the way science works. When you're faced with a novel situation, you work with the knowledge you have and you start investigating. And what that means is that early on, you're going to make some decisions based on the best available information at the time, which you're going to have to change as more information comes in. I think as a whole, yes, mistakes were made in the US, mistakes were made in other countries around the world. But I think the scientific community in the US has done a fairly creditable job in responding to this pandemic. The public health messaging certainly got complicated and messy because of politics in this country and other countries. But I think the scientific community, generally speaking, has come out pretty well from this pandemic.
Dr. McCormick, on Fauci's performance during the pandemic?
So I think too many people look to Dr. Fauci for all the answers. Just like everybody else, he made a lot of mistakes and he contradicted himself because we're learning about a novel virus. The problem is we didn't allow our scientists and our doctors to disagree with each other so we can learn from each other's mistakes. If you turn to one physician or one scientist and say, what are the answers, that's always going to turn out badly. You want to have comparative analysis. You want to have people who disagree so we can have good discussion. Every time we say this person's right, this person's wrong without actually knowing, then we make even more mistakes. And we did too much of a time, we spent too much time stifling people and their opinions rather than actually accepting that there may be different approaches to the same disease.
That's quite an interesting point, William Schaffner. Rich McCormick is referring to possibly the several times that President Trump may have actually got it right in retrospect. I mean, he was talking about scarves being used in place of masks if necessary, the benefits potentially of hydroxychloroquine, Regen-CoV-2, and stating that it shouldn't be discounted. It could have escaped from the Wuhan laboratory. In retrospect, do you think that the media and fellow doctors might have been a bit tough on anyone who dissented from the mainstream kind of opinion?
Well, I think Dr. Fauci, as has been said before, changed his mind, as we all did, as we gather more information. And that, of course, then influences public policy as the knowledge evolves. I think he has been the best sustained spokesperson for the science-based approach and the public health approach to the pandemic as it hit the United States. And he enjoys the extraordinary respect of the public health and the infectious disease community.
Well, as we've mentioned, Fauci's detractors criticize him for not taking the Wuhan lab leak theory seriously enough. And if you cast your mind back just over a year ago, that would have put him at odds with President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who believed it very much possible.
Chinese authorities claim the virus surfaced at a wet market in Wuhan. But U.S. intelligence is investigating other theories, including whether the virus was accidentally released by a lab a few miles away that had been researching pathogens carried by bats.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
This Institute of Virology is the only facility in China that has a level 4 biosecurity regime because it handles the most dangerous viruses in the world, including a range of bat coronaviruses.
Mr. Secretary, have you seen anything that gives you high confidence that it originated in that Wuhan lab?
Martha, there's enormous evidence that that's where this began.
溯源的问题，所以我想彭佩奥先生反复的讲，但他就拿不出证据来。
We have not received any data or specific evidence from the U.S. government relating to the purported origin of the virus.
Do any of the investigations show that the virus originated in Wuhan or from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
实际上我们很清楚。As we said early on, there's no way this virus came from us.
China is not the kind of country that would welcome a confession that one of its own laboratories was to blame for all this death and destruction.
I'll miss her every day. Being here won't be the same without her.
I feel for you.
China has a history of infecting the world, and they have a history of running substandard laboratories.
When you put it all together, there is a very plausible hypothesis here that someone became infected in the laboratory, walked out, and started to infect other people in Wuhan.
But how likely? Let's go to Tim Trevan now. Tim, you know a great deal about BSL Labs. Tell me, how strict is the security at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And is there any chance that it could have been taken out of such an environment, carried out by humans, perhaps?
Well, I have to preface this by saying I have never visited the Wuhan lab, so I don't have first-hand experience of it. But in generally speaking, BSL-4 labs are designed to be extremely secure from a architectural and an engineering perspective. The standards are extremely high. Things should not be able to escape from within the lab unless there's human error. So that's the first point. The second point is that a BSL-4 lab is only as secure as where you decide to do the work. If you're working with a virus that you don't realize is highly infectious, and you choose because you think it's an animal virus to work with it in a BSL-2 lab rather than the BSL-4 lab, you're not going to get any of the benefit from a BSL-4 lab from working in that BSL-2 facility within it. So just the fact that it's a BSL-4 lab doesn't and has facilities within the overall institute that are BSL-4 level does not mean that all the work is being done in the appropriate place.
And in order for us to know definitively, presumably we will need, the rest of the world that is, will need the cooperation, the transparency of the Chinese government. And hitherto that has not been forthcoming.
Yeah, BSL-4 labs are extremely complex organizations. And in complex organizations, when you want safety, you have to have transparency. You have to have that continual learning about how things really work rather than how you imagine they work. And that can only happen if people realize that reality can be different from the plan, and therefore everyone is able to speak up about anything they're concerned about. There has to be that level of transparency and that willingness to challenge the orthodoxy of view. And that was always my concern with BSL-4 labs in China, is that the national culture goes somewhat against that. It's a national culture of hierarchy and respect for elders. This doesn't mean that within the lab you can't create a more open, level, and transparent culture, but it means it's hard work.
And so these inquiries by the Biden government or by the WHO, they're only as good as the cooperation they receive. That means that no matter what they try on the outside, they're not going to get a definitive answer to their question.
Particularly at this stage, after the lab's been cleaned and we're closing in on 2 years from when the events happened, we're not going to get forensic evidence that is a smoking gun. What we have is suspicion generated by the Chinese response, some of which may be, some of that suspicion may be because we're mirror imaging how we would react and assuming that the Chinese are reacting because of those same motives, whereas it may be a knee-jerk Chinese reaction to hide up errors that have happened. So there are complex social issues at this stage. The best thing that could happen in terms of transparency is for the Chinese to uncharacteristically allow people to speak freely with outsiders. But I think at this stage, what we should be most focused on is all the possible ways this could have gone wrong, whether it's natural or whether it's gain of function or whether it's accidental release, and how we prevent those happening in the future. I think the actual apportionment of blame and finding the origin story now is less important than learning the lessons for the future.
And just a final question, Tim, we've run out of time, but you mentioned gain of function. I noticed that Fauci was being questioned pretty harshly about whether US money was being given to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to carry out gain of function research. Just quickly tell us what that gain of function research is and why you're concerned about it.
Well, gain-of-function research is basically anything which can change the characteristics of a pathogen and how it interacts with humans. So if it changes the host range from animals to humans, if it changes the immunological response so that vaccines no longer work against them, or if it increases the morbidity or mortality or transmissibility of the virus, that's gain-of-function. What was happening, as I understand it, was not really gain-of-function work. It was virus hunting. It was going out and looking for these coronaviruses in the bat population and trying to identify which of those viruses were closest to making that zoonotic leap from an animal virus into a human virus. So that's not strictly gain-of-function work.
Well, Tim Trevan, William Schaffner, Natalie Bettendorf, and Rich McCormick, thank you all for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated, and thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube, type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.